Brendan is not yet in the participant list, I believe, but we are now starting. So welcome everybody to SecDispatch. Next slide, please. Yes, so this is an IETF meeting and the note well applies. Please take a moment to read it if you haven't and understand it. And if you have any question, please contact us, your chairs, or any area director. Next slide, please. So these are list of useful links. There is the Jabber there, the minutes. Thank you so much to our minute taker, Dan and Carrick. You have a link to the slides and then our names, the chairs. My name is Francesca Palombini with Richard Barnes and Kathleen Moriarty. The the mailing list link is there, and then the charter. Next slide, please. Today we have a quite good agenda. So for this intro that I'm doing now, we're gonna do a test hum. Then we're gonna have Michael presenting the IDEV-ID considerations, the strong assertions of IoT network access requirements, Brendan, and then the GNU name system, Martin. And we have 20 minutes of any other business or open mic. So next slide, please. For today, I would like to remind the dispatch process. So the ground rules are the SecDispatch that recommends next step for new work, but does not adopt drafts. So please keep that in mind. The possible outcomes, which are also listed in our charter, are listed here. And yeah, I see that there is one. These are the possible outcomes: direct to an existing working group, propose a new focus working group, or both, redirect to a AD sponsorship, state that this is require additional discussion or community development is required, and the IETF should not work on this topic. Next slide. For some participation guidelines, since this is the first time using this tool, please, when you are at the microphone, state your name before speaking. Keep the dispatch question in mind when you want to do some comments. So the content discussion is very good, but we want to get to dispatch at the end of the presentation of the time slot. And if possible, please keep your comments to 2-3 minutes. Try to go to the point. And also, if possible, request both audio and video when joining the queue. So these are the buttons to do that. At least audio, but of course, video is also very nice to have. And I think, yes, that next slide is going to be the test hum. So just so that everybody is aware of how this works, if we need to use it later in the session. So that's the hum button, if you can press it. And I will start a new hum, and you can just decide if you want to hum softly or loudly, or also not hum. That's also a possibility. And Alisa, we can hear you. Oh, it's the music. Thank you. Thank you, fortissimo. How nice. So you can see the last hum result in the tab now. So I hope that everybody has had a chance to try this and understand. Yes, if my co-chairs want to say something else I might have forgotten. Otherwise, we can start with the first presentation. So yes, Michael, you can request screen sharing and video and everything. And you're up.
Hear me? Is my screen sharing?
I can hear you, see you, and I cannot yet see the screen.
Okay, try that again.
Let's try again.
There. Okay.
Now I can see it.
Okay, so I'm here to talk about a document that's evolved out of a bunch of other ones, and just a little bit of funny background. 1972, my dad returned from London with a baby and some software. In 1975, he got a job where they had a computer, and he let me play with it. But I had to learn to read first, so he read me books. Yertle the Turtle especially, Cat in the Hat Comes Back. We read it enough, a lot. He actually wore that book out. It actually fell apart. 1995, he's been pestering me, for some years. He wants to know, how does my computer know what to do when I turn it on? And we had a lot of conversations, and some of them involved autoexec.bat, if you remember that thing. And eventually he asked questions like, how does it know who it can trust? And here's me explaining what a BIOS is. Here's him asking some very intimate questions about IoT devices, and him getting pissed off because he doesn't want to do an update now. And every time I thought I convinced him what was going on, he would just say, well, you haven't told me anything. You've just added a turtle. And there was a stack of turtles going down all the way to, you know, what does electrons do when the computer first goes on and things like that. And he would say, look, you're just having little and little and littler cats. I want to know what is in the littlest cat. Can you tell me that? Well, at some point he said, it's got to stop. There must be something down there, he would complain. So this document is about what's down there. Okay. It's about the quality of the turtles. How do they get there? How can they be trusted? How much? And for what? Because different users have different risk mitigation problems. There are, as far as I can see, three fundamental ways to provision initial roots of trust. You generate them on the device, you generate them in the factory, or you do something with a co-generation with a common key. But ultimately, what you should understand is that the software update trust anchor rules everything, because he who gets to decide what software you run decides how you do everything else. And that's Discworld, and there's some elephants on a turtle. So talking about elephants. So the problem I discovered is that as you try to find out how people provision different things, you discover that none of them will talk about the elephant in the room because of a non-disclosure agreement. And so when you want to know, well, how do you actually do this? They kind of mumble that they can't talk to you about that. And if you would buy enough parts, they could maybe sign an NDA, and then life will be good. So my proposal is the same proposal we always do, is we add a layer of indirection. And to do that, we need to have some terminology that an auditor who could sign the NDA could return. And so this is the basic model. We need to recognize that the stage 1 bootloader key is actually the most important key in the whole system, despite the fact that it's a public key. It needs to be kept integral. The manufacturer, however, needs to keep the private key carefully. And fundamentally, what we want to know when we're doing supply chain security is whether or not that key has been disclosed by somebody else, whether or not that bottom turtle, whose name is Mac, whether or not he burps. So non-goals of this document are not aiming to write another ISO 27001. That's about audit processes and a bunch of other stuff, and says nothing useful about keys. And this document is not going to make any recommendation as to appropriate solution in a given situation. This is not a, if you have this risk, then you should have this solution. This document is, here are some solutions and their properties. So that's what the goal is, okay? That you could have a document. If you've bought a major appliance, at least in Canada, and I believe in many parts of the world, you will see an energy guide thing, and it will tell you how much energy this model uses. It doesn't say if that's good or bad. The refrigerator with the ice maker in the door has a much less efficiency than the one without. But that's your decision to decide whether you want it or not. And in some cases, you know what? The Cheetos holding the door shut is just the appropriate amount of security that you need. So the history of the document. We had the two documents in Anima. They are in their last throes of being published. And but they didn't cover everything, and there were a lot of questions. Well, how do I build this? How do I build that? How do I build the other thing? And so I wrote a document last fall on the registrar considerations, and it includes some advice on running an enterprise private CA. And I wrote a document about manufacture, and that includes how do I run the vendor private CA that I need for IDEV IDs, and how do I sign the vouchers? And it was in creating this document that I ran into these NDAs and these other problems, and so I split the document up. And so we have this document that you're looking at now, and the other document, which is basically intended to still be prescriptive. So that document, I hope, in a few minutes will be adopted by Anima, which is happening concurrently to this session. And the other document's in front of you. There's a bunch of stuff that could go into it, which I haven't put into it, including, for instance, Phil Hambaker's threshold key work, because that, in fact, may be a fourth way of generating private keys. So what to do? This supports work in Suit. This is the software update key. In TEEP, because TEEP uses Suit. In RATS, because RATS needs an IDEV ID in order to do an attestate for the attester to run. And it also needs a bunch of other trust anchors and the other parts that need to be provisioned in some ways. Obviously, this supports Anima. You could put this in LAMPS. After all, we're revising CMP, which is in fact a certificate enrollment protocol there. And if we were going to do, we did some work on EST as well in there, so you could put it there. And there's a bunch of other working groups that, also could do. But again, this is not a protocol. I'm not writing a protocol document. This does not say anything about any bits on the wire. It's not an applicability draft. It's something that I would like to be referenced by an applicability draft, and probably by people who are outside of this SDO. So what to do? I think what's left is you could do it in SAG, but it would need a lot of review. It could be AD sponsored, but I don't think it would get enough for review. Questions?
Go ahead, Mohit.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes. Please state
Hi,
your
this
name.
is hi, this is Mohit. So, in principle, I think having these kind of recommendations is good. What I'm worried about is how do we get actual people who are in the supply chain business and have seen what a factory floor looks like and what are the complexities involved. How do we get those people involved and those people to actually review? Because I'm worried we might end up writing something that's absolutely not possible. And my second concern is like, again, it's kind of related to the first concern that these things are way more complicated than what they seem. So when I say a device of course has a chip, and the chip comes from one of the vendors, and the vendor has licensed the technology from someone else, and there is all sorts of complexities involved that I'm not saying that this work should not be done, but I guess my recommendation to the ADs would be how best to involve the people who are involved in this supply chain to review these kind of things.
Yeah, I think your concern about getting the right people is absolutely a problem. I've been passing the existing document as in its various incarnations. I've been trying to pass it into other places, and in fact, I've been trying to say, yes, I understand you can't answer it, but maybe you can pass it to the person who is authorized to answer this. Maybe they can answer it, or maybe they can tell me what's wrong. And I agree that is a problem, and it is something that I believe that a little bit of effort and a fairly large amount of a lot of talks and presentations that will get the right people to review this and contribute it to it. I think that for the companies and the manufacturers that have spent a lot of stuff, I've heard numbers like $10 million to make this work well in a chip fab line. That for those who have invested that money, rather than thinking, oh, I don't want to tell them all my secrets, I would say that maybe the message is, well, wouldn't you like to force all of your other competitors to do something at least as complicated? And we're not actually asking them to tell us their secrets, but rather, what are the results that we can depend upon afterwards?
Okay. Next, Ben. Go ahead.
A few people after me in the queue, so I'll try to keep it brief and high level. Sort of following up on Mohit's point, it sort of seems like the premise here is that we have written a bunch of protocol specifications, or will be writing, but what we really want is to have an ecosystem that uses those protocols, and this document is about getting the inputs that we need to the ecosystem to be able to make our protocols usable. And so in that sense, it seems like a very useful thing to have some guidance to the people who produce devices that we want to use about how they can incorporate properly into our ecosystem. But I think the key question that's been coming up again and again is how to get the right people to look at it. And I don't have a great answer for that.
I would be happy to not give them guidance, but rather to listen. And they would say, well, I made one that's orange, and someone says, I made one that's blue. And we would say, oh, okay, so you have a blue process. And that means that when someone is doing an audit of a complicated system with many MCUs and other things like this, that they would say, well, I need to have devices that are at least all in that same category, right? And how they achieve it, not our problem. That's, some other evaluation process. But at least they would be saying to us, well, these are devices of a particular quality, and they've been manufactured with a particular care, and therefore they're suitable for your stuff. And all we want to do is enumerate what those different categories are of care.
Sure. I think that's probably a good way to think about it. Thanks.
Okay, next, Roman. I can't hear you, so you're maybe muted.
There we go.
I think you may have just answered my question, Michael. So I'm just double checking. So the thinking is that we effectively have a reference model of hypothetically how people should do it. And then manufacturers would attest to, I'm not going to show you all of the details, but I'm number 2 out of section 2 of this document. Or if you had an auditor drop in, they would come back and say, yes, I saw all the stuff behind the door, and they really do conform to number 3 on this list, or some 2+3.
Exactly. That's exactly the only way I can see us getting the elephant visible without actually seeing the elephant.
Okay, perfect. Thanks. And so then I just also echo the other things that were said, which is, are we confident that we have enumerated all the details, given that we don't have necessarily a lot of access to the folks that have the details of this process?
Yeah. So I think that from what I've heard from a number of people, Lawrence Lundbling, for instance, has said a lot of things and then stopped in the middle of a sentence, for instance, as though I can't say that. And so I said, okay, well, it would be nice if you could simply smile at the right point, and then that would be great. So I think I'm in the right place. I got this private message actually about this may interact with NIST 800-63, and that's also some of the feedback I'd like to get is there's this document that you may have missed. And so I think I have looked at that document, and I think it was specific to specific things, but I'll come back at it again.
Henk, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, this is Henk. Audio's fine?
Yes.
Excellent. So yeah, I think there are a lot of, a lot of supply dynamic directed cyclic graphs out there that people often perceive as supply chains. And yes, therefore, I think it's very important to have a lot of people involved that know how these work. But at the same point, it is very important to guide that discussion very carefully and revisit, I think this is the problem statement that is the heart of this ID, and revisit that and then do sanity checks on it, and then still aligned with, because everybody, there's so many people involved in this that this might be a never-ending thing, and then this becomes this turtle stack itself. So I think we have to have a very precise vision problem statement that we revise iteratively, like a mandating milestone. And then this could work, I think.
Okay, thank you, Henk. I'm still not hearing a lot of answer to the dispatch question, but it's a good discussion anyway. Ecker, go ahead.
No audio.
Can't hear you.
Now?
You are
Yeah.
yes.
Fine. Okay. This does seem like something that would be useful to have, but I don't really think it's an internet question. It's something like the way that certificates are the public-private key certificates for CAs are generated and handled. It's important to us, but it's not really our thing. And this is even less our thing in the sense that like these devices are, you know, are like endpoints that have specific policies, not internet visible. And I also don't really think that we're going to be, given the difficulty you seem to be having in getting people to directly engage, the idea that sort of the ways it's going to work is that some small numbers are to go back and forth with those people who aren't going to publicly engage and like watch for like which way they tilt their head. Doesn't seem like it's going to work out real well. So I think if those people want to have something, they should form their own consortium a la CABEF and figure it out and publish some stuff, like the BRs, which by the way do have a bunch of material on this, which runs quite long, which mostly says you better describe something in your CPS. So I think that while this is interesting, we should not do it.
Okay.
Okay, Warren, go ahead.
Audio works. So I'm not arguing against this, but I think we do need to be a little careful that people don't get the wrong impression from it. Just because you have sort of a checklist and I fall into this bucket doesn't actually mean that the system that gets generated is secure, right? Like your example of the lock with the cheetah probably meets a whole bunch of checklist things, but the ultimate system doesn't work well. And there's a large risk that auditors don't end up understanding what they're doing and just go through a bunch of checklists and be like, yes, did this, yes, did that, therefore system equals good. So just a soapbox rant.
Okay, Dave Taylor.
Question for you, Michael, on the NDAs and what you've learned about them. What I'm wondering is if the NDAs would actually prevent, say, auditors from saying what color it is. In other words, I find that the draft is actually quite useful, but the question is it actually such that nobody would be allowed to use the draft because of the NDAs, or can you say anything more about the nature of the NDAs?
Well, I mean, of course, the NDAs, of course, often have NDAs. No, I haven't been offered to sign the NDAs, so I don't know. Most of the answer is, well, put in an order for 100,000 parts and we can talk about this, right?
What I can't tell right now is whether the draft would actually be used, right? Because if you're saying, here's a set of colors you can use, but we're not allowed to tell you what color it is, then nobody would use the draft, right? So,
yeah. So, you know what? If we went down that road a little bit, and we discovered that was the case, then I would agree that we should just abandon it, and that the only way forward is what Eckert suggested, which is that the relevant industrial fora would have to basically repeat this work in each of those places. My experience is that those fora look to us for the fundamental underlying questions, and that, you know, determining which color of security they need and whether the Cheeto was sufficient is something that they actually do rather well, and they do it with their own risk at their own peril, right? So they know that they're going to have to live by these rules and things like this. But at the same time, they do come back and, you know, they talk about 5280 certificates and CMS and SCEP and all this kind of stuff. But they fundamentally look to us for the building blocks.
Okay, Rich.
Hi, am I on? Yeah, I guess so. I think this is kind of neat. I tend to not like architectural block diagrams as IETF documents. To answer Francesca's question, I think it's premature to adopt this anywhere short of having some part of industry sign on and agree. I
Okay.
would suggest maybe go to something like the Trusted Computing Group, which has a track record, even if it's only one instance, of working with the IETF for the suit rats teep stuff. Otherwise, this is going to land with a thud. And yes, it's too bad, but we previously looked at the parallel I draw is to the network files, the internet file system companies. We had a BOF and there was nobody there and they weren't interested. So I think
Okay.
I understand it's also a hard problem because you can't go to a big company and say, hey, we want to document, we want to do an information model for your stuff, and be only one person without having the weight of the IETF behind it. But I just don't see this as succeeding.
Fair enough.
Okay. Lawrence?
You can hear me. A couple of points. One is that it seems, in terms of describing what color is this or classification is this, you become similar to certification programs, because the GP, the Global Platform TEE certification program would do some of the classification. The FIDO certification program, which I worked on, also does some of this classification. It doesn't specify implementation or architecture or anything like that, but it does set requirements so you can kind of know how well does it do these things. So there's in some way there's some clues in the certification programs, and in terms of classification, that's one thing. Another thing is that it seems like a lot of the value of this is because a lot of people want to know. So it's not for maybe it's not because we're trying to drive the manufacturers. It's because a lot of us want to know what they're doing. And the third one about the TCG is TCG is definitely a particular architecture driven by some particular requirements in a particular way. It's not a general solution. It's, for example, it doesn't line up the same way with the TEE world.
So a lot of this has come from supply chain auditing problem, right? And there are some high-level efforts to make a lot of this happen in a number of other places. But what was obvious to me is that there was no low-level description that they could rely upon, and that as the number of parts that have security goo in them increases, hundreds of MCUs in an automobile, that the ability for them to actually go and investigate each one becomes less and less, particularly as there's multiple layers of subsystems involved. And this is where some of this effort, came from, is trying to make something that people could point to at a higher level. But I think that your point is well taken, and I think that Rich's point is also extremely well taken.
Okay. I think we had Leaf in the queue, but he stepped off the queue. I don't know if he wants to say something. Okay. Okay. Then we can wrap up. Richard, do you want to, or?
No, I don't have a lot more to say. There are some links that I put in the slides, some of the conversation, if you want to catch up on where they are. And if you don't know anything about turtles or cats in the hats, there's something you could watch for that. Thanks.
Thanks, Michael. So just wrapping up a bit here, I think what I was hearing from the feedback from the floor here was a lot of feedback that this seems a bit afield from where the IETF's core focus is, and that we need to get, if we're going to do something here, then we need to get some clear indication that we're going to have the relevant folks, both producers of devices that would be conforming to this, or producing things that would be categorized according to this, and the folks who would be consuming that, showing up and saying that they'd contribute to this work. And I don't think we quite have that right now. Or at least, especially on the device side. I think we may have some consumers here, but not so much on the vendor side. So I think this sounds to me like it's a no for now, but maybe could come back if we had some of those the vendor involvement and people saying they could speak to those architectures a little more directly, make sure we had the right taxonomy. Does anyone want to stand up? I don't think we need to take a hum because the feedback was pretty uniform on that point at least. But if anyone wanted to stand up and say that's the wrong decision, like, now's the time. All right, I think we'll consider that dispatched then. Thank you, Michael, for bringing this up. I agree with some of the folks in the queue. This is, getting these sort of things, getting some taxonomy would be useful. We just need to make sure we have the right community. All right. Next up is Brendan, I believe.
Yes, Brendan. You're going to share your slides as well? That's good. If you prefer to do so. I gave you all the rights.
Sorry, it takes a minute to turn all of the things on.
Yes.
All right. The title is indicative of where this originated. I guess, Michael, you're a tough act to follow. All of those turtle references. I don't have any. Maybe there are some turtles here anyway. So the big question that I'm trying to answer is, who is actually qualified to define what a device should do when it's connected to your network? Now, MUD goes in a direction of defining what a device should do, but I think there's a gap about who should do the defining. So the problem domain here is essentially around where MUD URLs come from and how they're authenticated. So in the existing MUD infrastructure, we have both unauthenticated and authenticated ways of reporting MUD URLs. I'm assuming that people know what MUD does, but on the off chance that they don't, I'll just quickly say MUD essentially gives network infrastructure policies to apply to individual device communication. So for the unauthenticated model, I don't think we really need to follow that through very much. There are some clear problems with having an unauthenticated reporting mechanism for a security property. So I think that really what I'm comparing against here is the 802.1x variant of MUD reporting. A service hosting a MUD URI effectively gains the ability to set policies on what your network does. And those policies are subject to change, which is the reasoning behind using a URL instead of doing static reporting. MUD signatures are also a way of locking this down. So the section in RFC 8520 that describes this specifies that MUD signatures will require a root of trust, and particularly an audit of that root of trust. The term they use is checking web reputation. So there are a few complexities here. If a device reports the wrong MUD URL, then it can pretend to be a different device. Now, that's one of the reasons I say that we probably only care about the 802.1x equivalent. The server hosting the MUD URL, like I said, it gets the ability to set network policy, so it requires an audit and probably signatures. Again, RFC 8520 says use web reputation to evaluate the server. 8520 also calls out explicitly the possibility of a rogue CA authorizing a rogue MUD signer, which would then give you the ability to arbitrarily change network policy. And the other part here that seems concerning is that device communication might be altered by plain configuration, not actual deep changes to device firmware or anything like that, but just by configuration. So you might need multiple MUD URLs for a single class of devices, and that adds some complexity in itself. So I want to look at simplifying the trust model. And the way that I see doing that is by binding the base set of policies that a device has to the entities that actually know about that device. So those are the authors of firmware and the entities that do device configuration. They're the ones who know the most about these devices, so they know how they should behave. And what's interesting about this is that if we bind that together, then they could specify a MUD file or explicitly delegate a signer. Yeah, IPv4 versus IPv6 being an interesting example of how you might want to change policy on a device based on configuration. So the way that I'm proposing that we bind this together is using suit and EAT. The idea would be that a suit manifest could specify a MUD file, and there are a few interesting properties there. The first is that you obtain a MUD file before a device actually needs it. And what that does is it eliminates any latency on first use of any given MUD file. But that's probably a minor thing. The more important one is that it binds the firmware and configuration to a particular MUD file. If MUD file delivery is how this is handled. If we used a MUD URL instead, then it would bind a particular MUD signer to a given version of firmware. And then to determine which MUD file or signer applies to any given device, you can use an EAT token to deliver the information that actually specifies that back up to the network infrastructure. So in an attestation use cases, having a device attest its MUD URL, MUD digest, signer ID, or even its manifest digest, if the manifest does in fact contain that information, allows an alternative to 802.1x based MUD URL reporting. And that can make the MUD manager into a relying party in the attestation workflow, which allows it to verify correspondence between all of this information. So that gives us a number of advantages. It reduces the number of actors in your system. You're already trusting your firmware vendor to do particular things, including determine how your device behaves. So if you're already trusting that party, then there's an argument for reducing the level of complexity in your supply chain by including both of these authorities in the same location and coming down to a single audit rather than multiple audits. It also makes an explicit authority chain where you don't actually need to bring in a new CA, which means that the rogue CA scenario drops out of the threat model. And it removes MUD file hosting from your threat model as well if you deliver the MUD file directly in your firmware updates. If you don't want to use that approach, then of course you still need to establish whether you can trust your MUD file hosting. The other thing that this brings up is whether MUD file composition is necessary. There's a fairly solid argument for being able to deliver a baseline, essentially a definition of how a device should behave with specific network rules that are delivered from a different party. So that I think that there would be a question around that as well. There's a point about onboarding flows raised in 8520, and it's specifically around tracking how MUD files change over time and how the signers of those files change. And I think that that brings out a requirement for an onboarding flow. And what this would do is it would allow you to automatically verify those onboarding flows. So yeah, it's an alternative essentially for 802.1x MUD URL reporting. So this originally came up in Suit, and the chairs of Suit did say at the time that they thought that Suit would be a good home for this, or a home for it. and they'd be happy with that, but they felt that coming to SecDispatch would be the right first choice. And that's all from me.
Roman, go ahead.
A lot of approvals in the browser to talk. So good afternoon, Brendan. I just wanted to say, I think this is kind of really nice. It links together different IETF technologies, potentially for mutual reinforcement for kind of better security. Happy to hear from the floor. I would just say that my squint of the suit charter is that it would be in scope if that's what the working group wanted to do.
Okay.
Okay, so I guess the question is if anybody has objections to getting this work to suit.
I mean, for me personally, rats also seem plausible, but I'm not really involved in either working group, so open to feedback from folks on whether it makes which of those is, whether the default suit track makes sense or whether rats would be better.
I also read from the Jabber suit. Okay, Kathleen, from the floor.
Okay, good. You can hear me. I think rats might be good. And another consideration is that this could also be an extension to a CoSWID, right? So there's a few ways you can package it that make a lot of sense. And for those not familiar with a CoSWID, it's a software identifier, so SWID, but in a COSE format or COSI format. And there are extension capabilities that way. You know, if the vendor is issuing a CoSWID anyway that's signed, they would just include this, right? So it needs to be there too.
One of the mechanisms that is probably relevant there is that suit already contains a mechanism to contain a CoSWID. So that would absolutely fulfill the suggestions that I've made already.
Yeah, and an EAT can too. So
yeah.
I think we probably have to think about this a lot more in terms of what's going to be most practical, what's actually going to get deployed, what can we get vendors to do so that we get to common solutions that are easy to integrate and digest so that we actually achieve, secure hygiene, posture assessment, and so it's not just pushing a solution. So I'd love to chat more.
Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe offline, because I want to figure out what we think might have the most adoption potential.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Hank.
Yeah, exactly. Hi, this is Hank. Hi, Brendan. Yeah, so we talked about this a lot, and I think, yes, it could be in rats. Rats has its own muddy rats, so this is a muddy suit here, and we have muddy rats also, and so in rats it's a little bit of an hen and egg problem. Okay, it should be a rat, because you have to create evidence about the resources that evidence creation requires. So this is again Michael's topic, turtles. I think it's fine in suit or in rats in any case. I think both. Everything that is associated with the security context of mud has the same problem, and so this includes a generic part here, and that is, I think, the vital question where that should be handled. I have no clear answer to that, but I wanted to highlight there is a common denominator here that crosses multiple mud efforts, I think. And also, I love this.
Thanks, Hank. Dave?
Taylor, as one of the suit co-chairs, between suit and rats, I would argue, which I obviously participate in both of those, I would argue that it's more appropriate for suit, and the reason for that is it does touch on both, right? Because you talk about attestation claims and so on, but rats has a model that was modeled after things like DHC, which says we do the core stuff, but if you want to do your own options and stuff, that goes in the other working group and we review it, right? Rather than rats doing claims for every other working group, other working groups that need attestation claims can do claims, just have rats review it, similar to the DHC model. And I think this fits in that category where suit doesn't have that type of model, right? What goes in the manifest is currently squarely in the scope of suit. And so if you're saying it goes in the manifest and here's some claims, then put those two things together, tell me it goes in suit, not rats.
who's asking to have this sit at the mic as a suit chair. From a workload perspective, suit is working on a single manifest draft at this point. Our other drafts are in the publication workflow.
Okay, and Roman?
Yeah, I mean, the question I wanted to ask is, I mean, is there potentially work kind of for both? My read of kind of this particular draft was that it looked like we were making an extension kind of for suit to encapsulate just a little bit of information, which is not to say that there wouldn't be kind of additional work. In my head, that was in RATS to get some of that additional attestation information in. But the shim we're talking about here is actually kind of very narrow.
Yeah, it's a really narrow shim, and it comes out to, I think, about 3 possible information elements for suit. A similar number for RATS that it's not already handling, and I would imagine that if we were to put an extension in COSWID, it would be similar.
Okay, no one else is in the queue. So it seems that there is pretty much agreement that this belongs to suit. We've heard from the chairs and the AD. So I think you can go ahead and this is dispatched to suit. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
That's a quick meta question while I think Brennan, we're done, and Martin can get set up. Actually, Martin, quick question. Are you looking for me to drive the slides, or would you like to present your own? But while we get into that, Roman, in general, do you think this sort of new work for that is pretty clearly with a new working group? Do you think that sort of question should come to dispatch in general? Or should working group chairs be ready to do recharterings that are pretty close to their current scope more directly?
Yeah, I mean, that's a fair question, kind of, Richard. I don't know if there's a one size fits all here. I think what we just did was very healthy to figure out where to best land work between 2 working groups. And sometimes I could imagine a circumstance where the charters might fit kind of both, but there's a better way to do the work. So I of course, I personally welcome us to take it to SecDispatch just to make sure and kind of double check and we document why we put work in a particular place rather than it being silently decided.
And Martin, would you like me to drive the slides for you?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, give me 1 second to pull those up.
And by the way, we are perfectly on time, even a bit early. So very nice.
All right, there you go.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, thanks for putting us on the agenda. I'll document the GNU name system. We are basically making a specification of our current implementation of the GNU name system. My co-author, Bernd Fix, who is also doing an alternative, a second implementation of the protocol, and Christian, who is actually joining me today physically, but with appropriate distance. He may jump in the questions later on, but I'm doing the presentation. Yeah, you can find the draft itself in the link. Next slide, please. So before I'm going on to the actual state of the current draft, I just want to give a very brief overview of what the GNU name system is without giving any details, as they are in the draft anyway. Next slide, please. So basically, GNS tries to address some of the DNS issues, especially with respect of the points that are written here, like traffic amplification and censorship and surveillance, that are not already addressed by existing efforts, such as DOT, DOH, DNSSEC, and dprive. Next slide, please. So in a nutshell, the GNU name system is a fully decentralized name system. So it builds on the peer-to-peer model. Names are also not global in GNS. It does support globally unique and secure identification and features query and response privacy. which is an important key factor in DNS and is realized cryptographically. It also provides a public key infrastructure similar to how DNSSEC provides a public key infrastructure, and it's also using to identify zones, create zones, and then also delegate between zones. It is designed to be interoperable with DNS, and it is also designed to be usable in the sense that a user should ideally not even notice whether or not the old DNS in quotes is used or DNS. So we have done usability studies in this regard, I think last year or the year before that. Next slide, please. Beyond the, let's say, common use cases for DNS, like host addressing, DNS already has quite a few applications that use the name system in more or less as a directory. For example, the self-sovereign identity management system Reclaim ID. I think I presented this in IETF104 in the PRG IETF working group. There's also SecuShare, which is planning to use it as a way to discover social places. And we have also done, as part of our work on Dasein, where we also did the usability studies, to use it in healthcare and IoT use cases. And in this case, accident insurance. And we were also using it to basically connect IoT devices to web services without actually requiring a dedicated IoT cloud service, for example. Next slide, please. So regarding the technical overview, as I said, I will not go into the cryptographic details, only the high level, what to expect from when you read the draft. Yeah, next slide, please. So basically, GNS stores all of the zone information and record data, the public part, in a distributed hash table. So it requires a peer-to-peer overlay, distributed hash table, where resource records are stored. The naive approach would be to just think, because the distributed hash table is basically a key value store, is that the key is the name, and the value is then the actual resource record data. Of course, this is not how it works. Next slide, please. Because the details are in the draft regarding cryptography. But what GNS is additionally providing is query privacy. So whenever you query a record, a private information retrieval scheme ensures that an outside observer cannot see what record is actually queried, or what name is queried and what the data contains, unless the attacker already knows what he's looking for. So the queries do not reveal a domain name. Records are encrypted as values in the DHT. As a consequence of that, actually, the zones also cannot be enumerated. And this a bit depends on the used DHT, but it also provides censorship and DDoS resistance, as long as you can rely on certain properties of the DHT. Next slide, please. Now, this is just as an example to see the equivalence between how DNS works and how GNS works with respect to delegation. So the NS record equivalent in GNS is called a P-key record. A P-key record simply contains the public zone key of another zone. And basically, it works a bit different than for DNSSEC. Basically, the P-key record data tells you where to look next in a delegation. Next slide, please. So for a very simple example, let's assume that an administrator that is managing the .com zone has a zone public key of 5G0Z, and Bob, who has registered a bob.com as a zone in the .com zone, which is 7F5T. This means that the .com zone then publishes a key value pair in the distributed hash table that represents the resource record data that you can see in the table. So basically, the label would be Bob, the type for the delegation would be P-key, and the value is the public key of Bob's zone. Similarly, Bob can now put records into his zone by doing the same thing. So for example, putting under the label www an A record with an IP address. Next slide, please. So now if any other user wants to resolve this name, www.bob.com, she would simply first try to discover Bob in the .com zone, which was 5GOZ. So basically a get query from the DHT, and then iteratively query the DHT, just like an iterative name server would iteratively query name servers. Next slide, please. Until the actual record value for www.bob.com is found, which is the IP address that Bob stored. This is the general overview. So why are we here? Yeah, next slide, please. And why did we do this? So we actually have been at IETF and working groups a few times now. In IETF 93, we tried to register a special use domain name for GNS, which was .gnu, as part of a document that tried to register a few other top-level domain names as well. This resulted in 2 RFCs. One of them basically defined a subset of what was proposed, but not .gnu, and another document that basically tried to clarify this process. Then we were also invited to present our work at W3C and an IAB workshop in 2014. And we also presented the current state of GNS at IETF 104 at DINRG, where we basically also showed our way out of the problem that we encountered in IETF 93, which was to simply not put the GNS namespace under a special top-level domain, but instead just say it's its own namespace, right? It's just, it coexists. Last year, I was also presenting GNS at ICANN. They invited us as part of their emerging internet identifier panels. Next slide, please. So who is currently working on it? That's the GNUnet project. So it's basically me and Christian and Bernd, because we have received funding from NLNet to actually make a specification of GNS, including a second implementation for it, and also including the discussion and presentation with experts such as the IETF. That is why we are also here. Reference implementation exists. GNS has been first implemented in 2012, has changed a lot until now in GNUnet. The second implementation is actually written in Go. It uses some of the components of GNUnet, for example, the distributed hash table. But apart from that, is its own implementation according to the specification. So we try to actually make a specification from which we can then also create another implementation. And yeah, we also uploaded the current draft, obviously in version 01 to the data tracker. Currently, at this point, the document basically documents our current implementation and how it works, which is why we currently also gave it the informational tag. But of course, that is simply because we had to give it some kind of identifier for now. We are basically currently looking to collect feedback and improve the protocol and specification to that point. Next slide, please. So next steps, we have already received very valuable feedback, especially regarding to the cryptography, which we are planning to address soon. Most importantly, the trust agility. So at the moment, the way zone keys are used and the way zones are created is very static, but we're planning to make this more agile in terms of what kind of crypto can be used. And also improve the symmetric encryption scheme that we're currently using, which we basically inherited from older code in the current GNUnet source, which should be updated, and we agree to that. And there was also a lot of other feedback that we're definitely planning to incorporate already. Now the desired next steps at IETF, or why we posted this on SECDISPATCH, apart from receiving more feedback, is that we are also interested in whether or not any existing working group in IETF or IRTF would be suitable and interested in adopting this document, or if it would be better to discuss it there, or should or can we create a new working group? For example, we have been in discussion with the people from MEDUP who have aspirations maybe in creating a working group, and from our discussions, it seems like we have very complementary goals, and it might be reasonable also to integrate their protocols and ours. Yeah, I think that's my part. Thank you.
Thanks, Martin. I hear a bit of echo. Let's see. I'm going to mute you just while I'm talking so that, yeah. Okay, so from the mailing list, we got some feedback, and I interpreted it as probably not to do in IETF, or if you do, needs more discussion and should probably be in standard track rather than informational. It might be the wrong interpretation, so please come to the queue and state your opinion. So first is Wes Hardaker.
Hi. So thanks for bringing this. It's really nice to see it formally documented. I've listened to all of, I think, the presentations you listed in the past. I'm certainly sad that the IETF and ICANN issues have, taken way too long to come up with a reasonable solution for a top-level TLD for projects like this that are technical, and that's, unfair. A couple of points. One, you say that you're interoperable with the DNS, and I wouldn't say that that's entirely true, just because it's designed to be, not designed, conflicts can arise, and there's a preferencing order, so it's really a second naming system that is parallel, and there's other ones too. I mean, the DNS isn't alone. The biggest issue that I have of where this might go would be, why would we pick GNU DNS? So it's actually, of all the distributed technologies, it's my favorite. But, which is the right model technically, privacy, ease of use, scalability? Not sure, which, that first come, first serve is the right model here. So, which is sort of where you're at. So a couple other really quick questions. One, why do you look like the DNS at all, right? If you're going to do something completely different, you might as well just deviate. Why are you using similar packet formats and things like that, like resource record types? You're missing an integration and deployment model, which I think would be critical if we were going to see this deployed. So to me, it still seems rather researchy, right? Why would we do this instead of ENS? Why would we use this instead of some of the other technologies? Why, if we're going to do a completely replacement of a globally unique naming system or non-unique naming system, as you claim, certainly it seems like research, not like a working group. And so DINRG is probably where I would target it. I would worry that they'd get overwhelmed if like all of the distributed technologies came to that group. But that'd be my choice.
We can move to the next. Ed, go ahead.
Ted Hardy speaking from Google. I guess I have three questions, one of which is procedural. And the procedural question is, you understand that if it does come to the IETF, that change control shifts to the IETF at that point, and that the resulting protocol would not necessarily resemble the existing protocol very tightly. And I think you said at the beginning you wanted to document what you wanted to do, and that's a different goal necessarily. The second thing is, I look at this and I feel like much of the relationship to the DNS is described in ways that misses the fact that this actually doesn't map very well at all to the properties the DNS is trying to give you. It maps to the query response model in a more private way, and it maps to some of the packet formats much more directly. But the idea of the DNS and having a single root of the DNS is to provide a namespace for the internet applications which are known to be globally unique at a particular point in time. And I feel like this hyperlocal root system and this approach gives you a very different set of properties. It gives you the ability to mint names very easily, and it gives you the ability to resolve names in multiple different roots. And especially because the way you're mapping it into the DNS is providing a DNS name, and it's actually not clear from the 01 draft whether you mean a label or an FQDN, but you're also telling it what server to ask about that name. You're getting into a place where phishing style attacks are extremely easy if people were trying to build something on top of this that looked like a URL, or that looked like most applications' usage of the DNS as an authority. This has very fundamentally different uses as an authority. So I almost feel like the cryptographic stuff in here, other people will no doubt talk to, but that you got told to bring this to the wrong dispatch group, because the people who build on top of identifier spaces are actually the applications folks over in the original dispatch group, and who would have asked the question from the beginning, what namespaces do you need to build this for? Because some of the ones referenced in the draft, like user identifiers in a local system, this actually might work very well for, because that local system has a property of uniqueness that's not related to the global property of uniqueness that the DNS has. So I think from a dispatch perspective, if this work happens in the IETF at all, and I think that comes back to the first question I have of whether or not you actually just want to document this or to see change control. I apologize for saying you should dispatch this to dispatch, but I'm afraid that the actual answer here is it's really not about whether the cryptography works, it's about what the identifier properties are. And that, I think, is either a BOF or a dispatch question. Thanks.
Thank you, and thank you for keeping it to the dispatch question. Very much appreciated. Ecker, you need to request audio as well. I'll give you video in the meantime, or you can just start audio yourself.
Okay, yeah, I'm talking now. Yeah, I mean, to what Ted was saying, this is rather properties that are sort of disjointed to those of the DNS, in that it overlays on pieces of the namespace, so you have inconsistent results, and also, that seems like not a property which I understand how we're gonna like actually document an IETF. In terms of the dispatch question, sorry, take a step back. I always have a number of concerns with the cryptography of some which I was voicing on the chat. But in terms of the dispatch question, I guess I don't really understand what it is you want. If you want to document, you want this documented somewhere, the ISC is where you go. If you want this worked on somewhere, this seems like pretty clearly a research project. So DNRG is where you go. And if you want this standardized, then I don't see us doing that. So I guess I don't understand what it is you want.
Martin, you want to answer to that? You need to request or start audio again. You should have audio now.
Okay. Yeah, maybe before I answer that question, I would like to also answer the questions from, I think it was Ted. So I said that this was informational because it's implemented, because that's what it currently is, right? But that doesn't mean that this cannot change what's in the document. Like we are not married to the current implementation. If there are improvements to it, if there's ways you can do it better, then there is nothing that probably cannot be changed in this document. Regarding the single root issue, let's call it, yeah, it behaves similar to hyperlocal DNS. So you most likely there will be a default root zone shipped, right? So most likely most of the name will actually be globally unique for the regular user. You only always have the option to override, just like with a hyperlocal root, to do that. Regarding the dispatch, I don't know, that's something that I cannot really answer. I'm not so much an expert in where to dispatch it. Regarding where do we want to discuss this? This is, in my opinion, also open for discussion. Obviously, GNS was initially a research project, and it partially still is, but at some point we do want to graduate from that, right? It shouldn't be always just a research project, and then there should be a path out of this, ideally for us. Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, I think
Go ahead.
I think the answer to this is that someone needs to mute, probably Martin. That I think the answer is, like, if you want this developed in the iStar community, the place to take it is IRTF.
Okay, Ben, we can see you, and you
Hi.
need to start. Yes.
So I think, as a couple of other people have pointed out, there are a bunch of proposals for alternatives to the DNS, including things that I've heard of are Ethereum name service, Namecoin, Handshake name service. And I think that one of the things we have to recognize is that it's appealing to mint alternatives to the namespace, because then you get to define who the root is. There's an incentive, all else being equal, to create fresh namespaces over and over again. And so I think one of the sources of caution here might be that if we allowed GNS into this, if we say that we want to work on GNS, it becomes very difficult to explain why it is that we would work on GNS, but not all of the many other proposed alternatives here. And I think a vast proliferation of competing namespaces with identically formed names that serve almost the same function and literally can be identical when presented to the user is a very poor outcome. I know you said that you looked into that you looked into the trying to allocate a special use TLD, and we're not able to get that allocated. But of course, ICANN has the GTLD process by which anybody can acquire an actual TLD. It seems to me that that's the logical integration point in order to interoperate correctly with the rest of the DNS. So if you want to have things that look like DNS names, then they should chain up to the DNS root through a name that you control. Anything below that point is your call. You can do whatever you want, including GNS. That process isn't free and it isn't entirely easy, but if you add up all the costs of time and effort required to get something through a standards body, you might find that it's actually competitive.
Okay. I just want to remind you to please state your name. So, Rich, you're up.
Hi, Rich Sauls. So first I want to say, thanks for your persistence. I mean, you keep coming up and knocking on the door. I think at the beginning of your conversation, you said, well, at the beginning of your presentation, you said, well, we have an existing protocol, we want to get that documented and so on. And then later on, that became, or later on, you said, well, it's still work in progress. We're still looking to evolve it. And I think the first argues against any kind of IETF thing, unless it's a historic protocol. We tend not to document those things. But the second is real important, and I think the second is interesting, if only because of the nerd sniping of all the cryptography people that was going on in the chat room. The problem is, or a problem that I see, is that there's multiple places where this could go. Is it a deployed project? Is it a research project? And so I think perhaps, and it's awkward until we meet in person, a BOF to get people together. And I know you had a BOF before, but it was mainly a presentation. You've got to, post an individual draft, or maybe SecDispatch adopts a draft. I don't know if that's even possible. And you get people say, look, we're interested in actually working on the next version of this protocol. Who was interested? And then from the community you get there, see, well, is it a research group? Is it is it tweaking? Is it a real security or DNS group? But I do, again, appreciate you trying to come here and get a community. And I think the problem right now is we don't quite know where it would be. That's it.
Okay. Just to answer your question, no, SecDispatch does not adopt drafts.
Yeah, I figured.
Okay, so next in queue is Warren. Warren, go ahead.
Kamari, for the record. So let me start off by saying I think the technology is cool and sexy. Like, I think it's really interesting. The bit where I think we run problems is trying to use this as a namespace for things like hosts. If it was a GNU namespace, or the system being used for user identity or many of the other things that we want to identify on the internet, I think that would be a good idea. But having it conflict with something like the DNS, I think, leads to really bad outcomes. As much as I might dislike it, having a unique www.facebook.com, which is clear to the user that that's the one they're going to, I think is a really important property. I'm largely going to agree with Ben, where if you were to have this rooted under a clearly delineated actual name, like a TLD, I think that would ameliorate a lot of the concerns and sort of security issues. But the way it's designed at the moment, I think you run into a lot of really dangerous issues with the fact that it's not unique. I need my version of www.facebook.com to be the same as Bob's version of www.facebook.com. This gets back to the Succo's triangle thing, which this does try and solve in some interesting ways, but I think it still runs into the a single unique way to look up a name is a very important property, at least in the way that users understand it and the way the system gets used at the moment.
Okay, Wes, you're up.
All right, so I have one request of you, which is you need to stop referring to the similarity to the hyperlocal root. And the reason being is that you are making claims that are not true. The hyperlocal root in 7706, which now is 8806, specifically says that it is the root just distributed in a different way. And you've stated multiple times that it allows users to make changes to the root. That is not true. There can be zero modification. DNSSEC protects that. Yeti is actually a little bit closer because they actually do change the key at least, but even they say that they are not changing the root. You are distributing multiple different roots, and that makes sense. But this you're misusing the hyperlocal root name that sort of has been coming out of ICANN. So please stop referencing it that way. Thanks.
Okay, Martin, if you want to answer to anything, please go ahead.
Thank you. I would actually also like to answer both. Okay, thanks for the hyperlocal root pointer. But regarding the use for the name system for other things, but keep it separate from DNS. I mean the technical definition of the protocol and how to resolve the records and how the delegation works is completely independent from the actual root zone governance, right? So the governance of the names does not hinge on the technical protocol that's underlying. So if you just look at the DNS specification, there's no wording of how the root zone is governed, right? So it's just a technical protocol on how to do things. So if that exists and it's only used for some specific applications and not for host name addressing, that is still a technical protocol that can be used as the respective directory, in my opinion.
Thank you. And Colin, go ahead.
So we keep talking about the pros and cons of this, but I want to get back to sort of the question of trying to figure out how to dispatch it. Like, what is your ask? I'm not 100% clear on what you would like to see happen, Martin. That's I think that's what I'm missing here in trying to decide how to deal with this next.
Martin? I can't hear you, so I don't know. It seems like you're speaking, but I can't.
Okay, no. Okay, now it works.
Now
It's just a delay always until that actually works. Well, ideally, we would like to see, for example, MEDUP stepping up and maybe become a working group and adopting the draft, for example. So if we could just wish for something, right? Then that would be the best outcome.
Any comment on that, Galen, or?
Actually, if I could put a slightly different spin on that. Are you looking to document existing practice here, or are you looking for feedback from a broader community and to evolve this document towards something that would be perhaps more broadly applicable or slightly different than it is today?
They're definitely the second point. So we're definitely looking for feedback. We're not, if we have to, we just document basically what we did, but that will not be our primary choice. All right, thanks for that clarification. So we've drained the queue here. Speaking as your chair, what I'm hearing from the floor here is that if this is going to get work done in the IETF, we need to probably have a full BOF and get some kind of simultaneous feedback from across a few different groups from a security perspective, as well as kind of some folks who know naming in kind of the internet area, and probably some folks who rely on naming in the applications area. So this is a real cross-area review problem that needs the full machinery of a BOF. Obviously, the decision on whether to grant BOFs is up to the chairs. So I wanted to reopen the floor briefly if folks have guidance to the chairs as to whether a BOF here would be appropriate, or kind of under what circumstances a BOF would be would make sense. And I will.
Okay, Kathleen.
Okay.
You're up,
I think setting up a mailing list may make sense so that we can track all the discussions in one place, and that can be advertised across groups, and that might inform whether a BOF is helpful. When it gets to the stage of requesting a BOF, assuming that is the direction it goes. I mean, it would be helpful to inform whatever ADs are making the decision to go ahead or not.
And maybe the ADs can jump in.
Yeah, if I could jump in, actually, that would be a question I would have to Martin. Do you think that another mailing list would help you sort through this? Or can we continue using SecDispatch, for example?
Waiting a little bit to get
sorry,
audio.
I'm muting myself because you can hear me all the time. Well, SecDispatch or MEDUP, for example, is fine for us. So opening another mailing list, I don't think it's necessary.
Okay. Next, Ben Schwartz. Don't forget to send audio. Yeah.
I support dispatch to DINRG. I just checked the charter for DINRG again, and actually they explicitly name check Namecoin and Ethereum name service in addition to IPFS as examples of in-scope items for them. I think that GNS is very much in that line, so I think that's where the expertise is here. And I also think that correctly reflects the level of maturity here, where we have out in the ecosystem a proliferation of proposals for distributed naming systems, and the IETF can't really get started on a standardization effort until there's some emerging consensus about how that should work.
Okay. Is there any DNRG chairs today that wants to speak up? Please jump the queue and come to the microphone.
Actually, Martin, if I could kick this over to you, I'm I've been told through back channel that there may have been some discussion of this in the DNRG context already. Have you gotten any feedback from that community so far? Not getting audio from you.
I believe that, so this has been KDEC. I believe that Melinda Shore will be sending some
Take
feedback.
some time until the audio catches up again. We have not received a lot of feedback from them whether or not they want to adopt it. Like we have presented it at IETF 104, as I said, but oh yeah, no, that was that working group. But we have not received any kind of feedback or have been approached to work on it there.
I'm sorry, Ben Kadick, you had some thoughts here?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that I'm told that some updates from the DNRG will be sent fairly soon to the SECDISPATCH list from Melinda, so we can get some more input from there.
All right, I think we can keep going with the queue here.
Yep, Ecker, go ahead.
I think I more or less concur with what Ben said. This does not seem like it's a sufficient level of maturity to be to have a buff. And the energy is the place for it. If you want it, not, as I say, if you want to have it worked on or get feedback, and if you just want it published as is, the place is ISE.
Okay, and Wes, go ahead.
You're in a weird place because you actually have sort of articulated the problem that you're trying to solve, but it's not fully clearly defined in terms of how it's going to address scalability and uniqueness with respect to the fact that you're increasing privacy and in making it distributed. And I think that if you try and hold a buff, that I don't think that's the right choice, because I think it would be a pretty big failure. And part of it is buffs normally shouldn't have a complete statement, right? It should be, one of the first questions is there a problem to be solved? Is this a problem that the IETF can solve? And I think that the answer to those right now by the general community, just guessing, would be no. And it's not that it's not important, or it's not that the properties of your system, aren't actually solving good problems. It's because of the conflict, because of the uniqueness, because of the scalability concerns, that have already been raised today. I think that'd be hard. I do think it's a fantastic research problem, and I think DINRG, as I think said in the very first comment I made, is probably the right place to go. But you need to ask them. Just giving a presentation isn't essentially good enough to get on their list of active drafts. You have to say, look, I want to make this an active draft. That seems like the right place to go to me.
Go ahead, Richard.
Oh, all right, folks. Thanks for the feedback on that question. So it sounds to me, so rolling back to the previous summary, sounds like the summary here is if there's going to be any IETF work on this, it needs a full BOF and a bunch of cross-area review. And it sounds like the feedback to the ADs on approving such a BOF would be that we need some deconfliction with DNRG and kind of an understanding of how this fits with that work to make sure that this is an IETF project and not something that goes over in the IRTF. ADs, does that seem clear to you? Do you want to say anything in closing here?
Thanks, Richard. That seems exactly kind of right. There are a lot of equities to consider here in the IETF. We could only get that by assembling kind of everyone in a BOF-like format. But as you said, there's a conversation to have in the IRTF that would inform whether we could pull this off. So in addition to that feedback, I would say that Ben and I are committed to go talk with the IRTF to figure out how this better aligns there, or how it better aligns kind of in the IETF to be a little more concrete on next steps for you, Martin. So we'll help facilitate and kind of broker that conversation.
All right, thanks, Roman. I think that brings us to the end of the GNS slot here. Thanks for bringing this up, Martin.
Thank you.
Yes, and we got 10 minutes of any other business. If anybody wants to jump to the mic.
Or we can just sit here in silence for another 10 minutes, ponder the implications of our decisions.
We could also decide that we want to go over to the hallway at gather.town and engage in
And give
such
that time up.
as we might.
I think that's an excellent suggestion. Why don't we go socialize?
Yes.
All right, folks.
Okay. So since no one else seems to have anything more to bring, I'd like, first of all, to thank our minute takers and everybody for a very useful and to-the-point discussion. This is the first time that, since I've been chair, that we finish before time. And thanks, everybody, for joining, and see you soon. Bye. Oh, Roman, did you want to say something?
Yeah, Francesca, I just wanted to put in the final word. I think one of the things that really helped us facilitate the conversation was a lot of prep beforehand. So the robust conversation on the mailing list on all the documents very much helps this process, as does having an agenda which points to all of that prior conversation. So folks that did not participate could walk in with all of that background. So really thank you to the chairs for doing that, and to the community. We need the discussion before SecDispatch, before it actually happens, to make this very productive. So please do continue that model. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks. With that, bye. Bye.